Hello, everyone. Welcome to the panel Post-Truth Society and the Dissolution of the Social Fabric. Since we have only 60 minutes for the whole session, I will very briefly introduce each of our speakers today and then move on to their interventions. First of all, let me tell you that I'm delighted to share the platform today with these three wonderful colleagues and friends who, for your information, happen to be authors in either or both of these volumes that mark the transition of the World Capital Institute into I don't know if it shows properly on screen, seems a bit blurry, but well, it is a bit of phantasmagoric. I move a little bit. Anyhow, it doesn't matter. This is Knowledge for the Anthropocene, ghostly volume, and the other one as well, City Preparedness for the Climate Crisis. These two volumes published by Edward Elgar last year that mark the addition of these two lines of research and public discussion with the World Capital Institute. So I'm very, very happy to welcome Carlos García, Irina Feygina, and Velina Petrova. Very briefly, I will introduce each in turn. Carlos García is an emeritus professor at Monterrey Tech. And well, rather than going through his bio, I can tell you that Carlos is as close as anyone I know that gets to a polyglot. He's learned of anything from physics to literature and mathematics, and of course now the Anthropocene. So Carlos, so happy to have you with us.
Same.
And then I'm so very, very happy to have with us Dr. Irina Feygina. Irina, you're a fellow psychologist. So I'm very, very happy because I'm convinced, absolutely convinced, that the core conundrum of the climate crisis is the human response to it. I mean, because we are aware, we know about the physics, and they are very challenging. We know about economics and so forth. These are challenging, but at the very, very end, the big question is whether we as humans are going to be able to respond in an appropriate manner or manners. So very, very happy, Irina, to have you with us today. Dr. Irina is a social psychologist who specializes in the behavioral aspects of policy and program development and implementation for climate change mitigation and adaptation, clean technology, adoption, energy efficiency, sustainability, and communication. Irina is also the lead representative to the United Nations for the American Psychological Association. Irina, most welcome. And last but not least, my dear friend and colleague, as a very close member of the WCI family for several years now, Dr. Velina Petrova, who is the Knowledge for Impact Director at Oxfam International. Her role at Oxfam focuses on the organization's effort to establish itself as a vibrant, knowledge-based organization, one that uses knowledge both to transform the world and to improve its own practice. This entails ensuring that Oxfam's extensive knowledge network of staff, experts, partners, and allies, as well as its experience in learning, are leveraged for impact. Velina, happy to have you with us.
Thank you.
So, my friends, let's move on. The dynamics for this panel will be, in order to keep it quite lively and intense, I will be posing the three questions in turn. The same questions to each of you in three successive rounds. So the first one is of a descriptive character, and Carlos, Irina, and Velina, in turn, would you please, within 5 minutes, give your best shot at the question. What are the most prominent expressions of post-truth in our current societies? Carlos, please.
Okay, let me show you a first slide. So, well, this is my take on this first question. Well, the most prominent expressions, well, there are many. Unfortunately, there are many expressions of post-truth, such as extremist social and political movements like right-wing populisms around the world, or white supremacism, or some Islamic collectives and so on. We have, especially for this, for the context of the Anthropocene, the anti-environmentalism that has been around since the 70s, perhaps, by way of petro companies, including climate counter movements, that is organizations that stand against climate action. Well, the well-known climate denial or denialism. And most recently, we talk about climate inaction or climate obstruction. And I just want to drop this idea that in this second expression, anti-environmentalism, we have the very notion of the Anthropocene as one of the expression of post-truth. And that depends on the definition of the Anthropocene, but that's for a later discussion. Then we have culture wars, more on the social level, like gender issues or same-sex marriage or mathematics education is on discussion now. The pandemics, of course, Marxism or cultural, so-called cultural Marxism, or woke corporations, or the infamous NRA. And then we have anti-science, like climate change, on vaccination refusal or the pandemic, evolution theory, abortion rights, or the very funny flat earth theory. So these are at least some of the most common prominent expressions of post-truth that, yes, do all these torn apart our social tejido, fabric, and issue. And well, in the next questions, we're gonna see why has this happened and how to do, what can we do about this? That's it.
Carlos, would you like to expand very briefly on that issue? You hinted at the background notion of the Anthropocene being built on a kind of a denialist perspective?
Yes, because if we just take the definition of the Anthropocene, the official, the Crutzen, Stefan, and all these guys' definition of the Anthropocene in its double aspect. On the one hand, as a new geological epoch, that's very technical, very scientific, who cares? Or as the global environmental impact of human anthropos activity. Well, then we have to ask, and many authors have done this, what about these humans? Who are these humans? At the end, we have, well, one of the answers is not humanity as a whole, but some corporations or in the whole, because we all, me, everyone are implied in this capitalist social order, which tries to maintain itself alive. So the Anthropocene is kind of a immunological answer to keep this hegemonic power on itself. It doesn't depend on the corporations themselves or on us, but it's more than like an emergent property of this hyper object, which is, again, not the economic system, but the capitalist social order.
Wonderful, Carlos. Thank you. Most enlightening intervention for these questions, which happens to have a more descriptive nature. Thank you. Let's move, if you would kindly leave the screen sharing. And now, Irina, your shot at what are the most prominent expressions of post-truth in our current societies, please?
Yes, thank you. Well, I think for me, probably the core expression of it is the polarization that we're experiencing, very much reflected in what Carlos was just saying, in terms of people taking positions on issues that are widely spread apart and that are very little interacting with facts or knowledge or research or any sort of knowledge gaining process that we typically think of as being appropriate for such complicated issues, and rather aligning beliefs with their groups and what they believe and what they espouse and what they do being very much based on aligning with the groups and with the ideologies and with the worldviews and general approaches to reality that people are identifying with. So I guess when I think about post-truth, to me, it means it's sort of, we're not in an era of, investigating reality and discovering something there and then engaging with that, but rather we're in an era of turning to a totally different source of knowledge, turning to our groups or turning to certain interpretations of reality and using those to inform us about what we believe. And that's very different, since I am a psychologist, as you pointed out, and that's my starting place of thinking about, well, how are people making sense of their lives, making sense of reality, and how is society coming into that process? And so that, I think, for me is the crux of it. And of course, that results in attacks on science, distrust in science, in medicine, in public health, because these institutions are in essence ones that engage with the world through this kind of empirical lens of investigating what's out there and trying to make sense of it. And this is no longer being seen as a valid way of making sense of reality. And so rather, it's about taking positions that serve people's interests. And I think in this case, interests that have to do with fossil fuels, with economics, with certain political advancement. And that's actually what's driving people's beliefs about what's going on. And not to say that this is the first time that's ever happened. Our beliefs are often influenced by our ideologies and our groups. And I'll talk more about that a little bit later. But I think the extremity to which it's happening now is reflective of this polarization. And I think for me, that's really core. And just to mention one way that this manifests is the segmentation or the isolation, or gosh, there's another word for it, the sort of the splintering off of people's sources of getting information and of gaining knowledge. And of course, because we have social media and we have such immense variety of places that we could get our information, we now have this total ice like bubbles in which people exist, so that they're only getting information that feeds into their identities, feeds into the things they already believe, reinforces these positions, and actually moves the polarization, yet makes it yet more and more extreme. And so in a way, it's once this process has gotten going, it's also self-reinforcing. And the polarization just feeds the polarization.
And since you have a little time left from your first intervention, briefly, from the behavioral perspective, which patterns do you see emerging in terms of how, at least in some societies, this polarization is happening?
That's a great question. Well, I'm based in the US, and I have done a lot of research in the US. A lot of my academic research has been focused on understanding climate change denial, both in how it arises socially, but then how it really is experienced by people psychologically, and why it's become so rampant. So, that's for me a really big manifestation. And then, of course, those. Well, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but I think the core interaction there is between the interests of the political groups that have financial and power interest invested in the denial. Then for people, that becomes, because they're they're sort of trying to hold on to certain identities, they're being fed this information that makes them, and they sign up for it because that makes them good group members. You can't really be a member of a certain group now without being denying climate change, or at least being skeptical, or at least keeping your mouth shut about the fact that maybe you're not skeptical, right? It's become part of your group membership to hold these beliefs. And so that's the way in which these political interests interact with people's belonging and identity needs. And then now that and that has sown a general sense of skepticism about science, and that has carried over into now with the pandemic and with vaccines. So it's become sort of issue by issue, that overall sense of distrust. That's the real core of how the leadership cultivates this polarization in people is through the distrust. It's spreading to more and more and more topics.
Wonderful. Most illuminating. Let's leave it there for the time being. Irina, your shot at the first question, please.
Thanks. I have the benefit of standing on the shoulders of two giants that just spoke before me, so I can just sort of pick up on what they said. I very much agree with what's already been said. So let me try to add or tie it together instead of repeating everything. When you asked this question, Javier, the first words that popped into my head were science and democracy. And those have already been covered in a sense. But we are living in the time where when you go to deny something scientific, you don't then offer another paradigm. You don't offer a similar but different paradigm, in the sense of, this is how I know about the empirical world, this is how I've observed or measured or interacted with it, and this is what I conclude, and therefore we need to shift from A to B. Instead, you deny, right? There is no replacement of paradigms. And if you think about, the two most recent expressions of that, or most sort of urgent expressions of that we're living with, which is COVID, the COVID pandemic and climate change, or the climate disaster, the impending climate disaster, you can see that quite easily, right? You could quite see that it used to be about medical science and public health, and it used to be about environmental science, and again, public well-being coming from that. And now it's about not that, right? It's not about something else, it's about not that. And that, of course, goes to this, cultivated polarization, as Irina is very nicely putting it. I'm loving this, the terms that are being coined here. And then the other bit about democracy, I am also based in the US, which I think will give this panel a kind of a flavor that, I don't know if you intended that or not, but it is what it is. But I'm originally from Eastern Europe, and have had the opportunity to live through various forms other than democracy, of people being governed and living together. And when I got here, I quite quickly realized that moment of saying democracy is a terrible form of governance, except for all the other ones, is quickly becoming extinct. Because again, we're now not in the moment of, here's democracy, here's something better. Now we're in the moment of not this, right? But then what? So then what is your alternative? And, for example, denying that math and counting votes means anything, right? Denying that 100,000 votes means anything is, in fact, yes, you could say denying math, but it's in fact denying a reality in which people used to argue about policy. And now they argue about, wait, did these votes happen? Can we count? Is there such a thing as a piece of paper called a ballot that you can actually look at or count or tick in your tally? And again, my biggest concern, and what I had been reflecting on as I was coming into this panel, is the figures I look to, for example, who made change in the world. Gandhi, Martin Luther King, they all said the way to make change is to offer an alternative reality, offer an alternative option where people can find themselves. And at the moment, we're busy destroying. We're very, very busy denying and destroying. And it's not the new truth, it's the old truth. So for me, those two moments of how we live in the world, which is going to science, and how we live with each other in that world, which is going to governance and systems of governance, are the two most key ones that we're seeing at the moment.
Wow, what a fascinating insight in that it kind of poses knowledge-based development against counter knowledge the development. So it goes at the very core of knowledge, the convergence of knowledge and democracy as public knowledge and public understanding. Fascinating. Thank you so much. And this takes us into our next round, which moves now into a bit more challenging level at the explanatory domain. So the next question for each of you will be, why do you think those expressions we referred to in the first round emerge? Carlos?
Okay.
Why?
Why do I think those expressions emerge? Well, basically, I think this expression emerged as a reactionary way, as a response, as a counter to, a reactionary way of defending and maintaining a given hegemony, like political, cultural, ideological, moral, religious, scientific, economic, or corporate, at least. So it's a huge movement in each case, including a use of violence or consent. All of these post-truth strategies serve to manipulate or to sell an idea or ideology. But at the end, what these collective actors in each case try to do is to defend themselves. So this is post-truth emerges as a response, a reactionary in this old-fashioned sense of revolution, Marxism. Of course, I'm on the critical theory position. So these expressions allow collective actors like the government or political parties or whatever to oppose authority, like Irina was telling us. They oppose authority to science, to some culture, to some beliefs, a set of beliefs, in order to claim to themselves a sense of own authority. Think of Earth flat believers. They oppose science and they have their own science. This foolish theory, but that's their own authority. So at the end, and this is very psychological, of course, there's the issue of identity, of who to trust. Well, if I cannot, for whatever reason, well, post-truth reasons, cannot trust scientists anymore, I trust on myself. Well, not myself, because we're dealing with collectives, with groups. So that's my answer to this second question.
Okay, before moving on, would you like to dig a little bit more on the socioeconomic dynamics behind this on a more historical perspective?
Well, yes, and more so on the Anthropocene context, because we have this dominating economic system based on the imperative of economic growth, the GDP as the new god, and the power, corporate power behind it, with the aim of accumulate more and more value or economic value, or well, money in mundane terms, money, or what Marxism call value or profits, or well, capital with a major C. So that's behind these counter movements, these reactionary ways, sometimes violent, like in fighting peasants or indigenous peoples who are moved away from their lands in extractivist struggles, or these what are called songs of sacrifice songs, and it is very obvious the economic or corporate interests behind all these struggles.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Two worldviews.
Excellent, Carlos, and this helps a lot because we are trying just to provide context and historical perspective, because as you all of you mentioned, this is not just a new phenomenon. This is happened along history, but it reaches several points in several societies where it becomes particularly grave and prominent, and this is one quite prominent one. So it's fundamental to understand what's happening behind in terms of the socio-economic background. Thank you so much, Carlos. And now, Irina, on the explanatory note, why do you think those expressions emerge?
Yeah, great question. So I think I want to offer the perspective that's more focused on how people respond to the kind of dynamics that Carlos was just talking about. Why are we so susceptible to them? Why have we let these interests take us along and bring us to places which are absolutely not serving the interests of most people? I think that's the question that I've really struggled with, is how is it that people forego what's in their self-interest, their well-being, their access to healthcare, to education, etc. Again, apologies if there's noise in the background. I'm actually at the COP27 and I tried to find the quietest spot, but it's Friday evening and I guess it's the last chance for protests. So, so I think very much aligned with what we're talking about, trying to wake people up, right? So these sort of things we've bought into that are actually really not in our self-interest. And so what I've discovered in my work is that, well, actually, the way I tend to start this is by asking people, maybe I can ask our audience members to think about this for a second. What do you think is people's most profound need? So beyond water, food, shelter, and safety, let's say you have those are absolutely our strongest needs. If you have those, what is your sort of higher level, most powerful need? I'll give you a second to sort of identify that for yourself.
Okay.
And it's the need to belong, because we are at root, we have other needs, it's not the only need, but that need, because we're social creatures, and for most of our existence as a species, we've depended on others for our survival and for our capacity to create an environment in which we can exist and survive and thrive. And so many of the things that we think of, like money or status, in the end, they come back to belonging, actually, to our status in groups and being valued and being seen in a positive light and appreciated. And a lot of times being ostracized, the threat of being ostracized from a group, like used to happen in, Christian settings, etc., was the worst punishment that one could possibly envision. So I think from that, though, that in some ways that's good, because look at the societies we've built, etc. But in other ways, it can be very challenging, because if our society and if our groups are not doing so well and there's things that need to change, we really struggle with seeing that and acknowledging that and finding the capacity for that change. Because being exposed to that information about things not going well, as is obviously the case with climate change, we have to change our industrial practices, we have to change our political processes, we have to change our ways of life personally, we have to change the way that we do local, urban living and transportation and food and everything. So seeing that is extremely threatening for people at that level of wanting to belong and wanting to protect the societies and the institutions that we're part of. So on one hand, we need to address this problem so that we can survive and thrive. But on the other hand, it involves changing the things that we're deeply wedded to in a way that's extremely threatening. And a lot of times people opt to recreate a sense or maintain a sense of security inside themselves by failing to actually see what's happening, pushing it away, creating some kind of a, alternative reality for themselves. And these political interests feed right into that need, because they say, no, climate change isn't happening, or we don't really need to change the system. Or so it's like it's allowing people an out right when they want that out. And I think there's been a lot of very intentional use of that proclivity in people to really feed into it and take advantage of it and feed the kind of misinformation to people that allows us to maintain a sense of everything is great with our society, we're doing well, we don't need to change anything, etc. Meanwhile, of course, all the evidence is to the contrary. So in other words, it's not just, I think for people, for individuals, it's not just a profit motive. Clearly the profit motive is there up above, but for people individually, it's more the desire to keep this perception of this legitimacy and fairness and stability and well-being of the system as we have created it, while in reality, it's really faltering and not meeting the challenges of our times. And into that feeds what's in psychology, it's called motivated cognition, meaning that if we have a really strong motive, a really strong need, like the need to see our system in a positive way, it will change the way our cognition works. It will actually change how we understand information, how we encode information in our brains, and then how we recall that information. And it even affects the way that we perceive with our bodies. So for example, just a quick thing, and I don't know if I still have a minute. We did a study a while back where we asked people what they thought. It was during a heat wave in New York City, and we asked people what they thought the temperature was outside. And then we asked them what their ideological positions were and whether they believe in climate change. And so people who did not want to believe in climate change perceived the temperature on average to be 7 degrees lower. So these are, I mean, this is our bodies, right? These are not things we have very much conscious awareness of. These are just ongoing processes that help us maintain this view of reality that aligns with our beliefs. So yeah, and so that's of course interacting with all of those political interests that want to get things their way.
Fascinating and so convergent with the capital systems perspective that we embrace at the World Capital Institute, where the most prominent meta capital is identity capital, the one that provides significance to the rest of them. Thank you. Let's move on. Velina, why?
Thanks. I very much appreciate the two perspectives. Let me try to offer another one, just so that we have fun here and we don't all agree about everything. I will just make one very quick personal reflection before I launch into this. I love this space, this conference every year, because I feel like when I come here, I am an activist among deep thinkers and academics. And when I go to my job every day, I feel like I'm a thinker and an academic among activists. And so that's a really great, I just love it. And so because Javier always asks for a lively session, and let me try to oblige here, let me try and share with you a few ideas about, just maybe another way of understanding this. And if you could just tell me, can somebody tell me you can see this? Okay, so I got to thinking, what exactly makes for fertile ground for us collectively to be in this post-truth and fake facts and alternative facts reality? And what makes it so threatening? What causes us to go into this motivated cognition with such urgency and in such massive numbers that Irina was mentioning? And I thought, what if it's the other way around? What if the social fabric started unraveling and it started falling away from us a long time ago, and now we're just living in the moment of that culmination of things? What if, as you say, Javier, what if this is a historical moment, but actually has deep roots? It has deep roots in history. It didn't just sort of occur when Twitter appeared or when, we had Skype all of a sudden to talk to each other. And I just wanted to show you here, there are very distinct social realities and social fabrics, multiple, that people are dealing with. We have on the one hand, in outer space, a guy who is there with his brother and his buddies, testing out a rocket that he's going to use to then get richer, right? And on the other hand, down below on the ground, where this earth that he just contributed to polluting further experiences the kind of famine that, in Africa at the moment, where every 36 seconds people could die. So imagine this is a flight for 11 minutes, and then we have every 30 seconds, you have a life lost from hunger, right? Not from something that science cannot solve. This is hunger. Let me try to go to the next slide here. Okay, here's another one. Musk just told Twitter staff, you either need to work long hours at high intensity, doing everything that is opposite to human well-being or to your health, because that's the company that I want to have, and those are the profits that I want. Meanwhile, if the 10 richest men, and they are men, right? They're not people, they're men specifically, were to lose 99.99999% of their wealth, they would still be richer than 99% of humanity. And these are two different realities, right? There are two very, very different realities. And social fabrics that start to splinter off because people live in this world of, is your child going to college or not? Here's this guy who owns numbers that you cannot fathom. Here are people who are dying of hunger and children who are dying of lack of water. Now, which fabric are you with? Which reality are you living in? I'll just run this very quickly. I went to look historically. This is by the World Inequality Lab, by the way, doing very interesting work. I've put the links there if you're interested. This goes back to 1820. Right? This didn't start last year. It didn't start in 2016 when Trump was elected, and neither did it start when post-truth was coined as a phrase. This is 1820. Now, notice the top 50%, and the top 10% owing half of everything, and the bottom 50 owing about 10%. Now, this has always been high. This is true, however you look at it. Right? If you say, but maybe income isn't the only measure, right? We've been saying this for a long time. Income isn't the only measure. And what happens if you look within a society at the inequality? We have surpassed that moment. We have lived past that moment. At the moment where you fall on that scale, the top 10% or the bottom 50 matters more than which country you live in. This didn't used to be the case, right? Between country inequality is still quite high, obviously, right? Compare the DRC to the United States, clearly. But at the moment, somebody in the US in the top 1% has more in common with somebody in the DRC in the top 1% than the bottom 50. Right, which social fabric is that again, that we're talking about? Then came COVID, right? Then hit us COVID. The 10 richest men doubled their wealth just during the 2 years of the COVID pandemic, the first 2 years of the COVID pandemic, doubled. Everybody else went into poverty, right? Everybody else lost their job or dipped into their savings or had to give up and forgo lots of things. And we had to go in lockdown so that our system wouldn't be overwhelmed. Our healthcare system wouldn't be overwhelmed. Not because it doesn't know how to deal with it, but because there wasn't enough for everyone. And meanwhile, from COVID vaccines alone, we have 9 new billionaires, not from other ventures, not from other investments, etc. No, COVID vaccines alone, right? And their combined wealth is more than what it would cost to vaccinate the world. But apparently we don't think that that's important enough, right? Last one, the climate crisis, which it didn't come now, it's always been there. So we now have what are called carbon billionaires. And what is that? So for you and me on this panel and for our audience, most likely, our carbon footprint comes from the things we do daily. You know, like getting on an airplane to go visit our family or recycling our milk bottles or that kind of thing. For certain rich people in the world, their carbon footprint comes from their investments. And those investments, if you look on average, are emitting more than 1 million times the average of someone like us, right? You and me and Javier and Irina and Carlos. And so there is there is something again about this reality, because we all have some investments, right? We all get a pension, or we get a social insurance of some kind if we are lucky enough to live in a country like that. That's also invested there. But again, look at the reality and look at the social fabrics people are dealing with. Which exactly social fabric do you find yourself in? Or which one is falling apart for you? And then I'll just say, we're talking about a cost of living crisis, right? We're talking about the cost of energy. I'm talking to my colleagues and friends in the UK who have switched off the heat, right? Because they can't afford the heat. This is not a cost of living crisis. This is a cost of profit crisis, because people being alive is not a crisis. The way that certain people need to profit is driving us into a crisis. And so I'll just tell you this, in 2021, right? This is again, 2020 and 21, the height of the COVID pandemic, when we're meant to be spending on health and social protection. And instead, poorer countries spent about a third of their budgets on debt repayment, right? Which is again, shifting money backwards, where it was taken from to where it needs to be more going to, their former colonial powers, as opposed to the other way around. You see BP and one bank, BNP Paribas, just as examples, making profits again in the billions that we can't fathom what this means. And meanwhile, we have governance that chooses to freeze or remove or lower taxes from the richest citizens. Now, that social fabric has been for a very, very, very long time in dissolution. It's been, whether purposefully or because of our inaction, disappearing and falling away and falling apart. And since 1820, that inequality has been building up and building up and building up. And now we're living in that extreme inequality crisis that gives rise to, I think, and I'm going to make this argument here, our susceptibility, our innate desire and need, as Irina will say, to go and find a safe haven. And motivated by that, we're only too happy to go and sign on to these post-truth and post-fact, and some of us would even say crazy ideas. Well, the other side thinks we're crazy. The opposite side thinks we've kind of lost our minds with these numbers. But again, maybe that dissolution started a long time ago, and now we're going to see it bear fruit for us, very bitter fruit for us, rather than the other way around. Let me stop there.
Well, thank you, Velina. You certainly managed to challenge us all. And let's move straight away into the third round, which is of a prescriptive nature. And the question is for everyone, what are the most effective means of countering post-truth today? Carlos.
Okay, let me share the presentation. Is it all right?
Yes.
Okay, I've got two basic answers. How to counter these post-truth regimes today? Well, one obvious way is by way of deprogramming or deconversion tactics or processes. I use commas because this comes from religious literature, and I see. I'm assuming I'm not a victim of post-truth, which is a very weak hypothesis, because these victims or post-truth people are like programmed to believe in some unscientific, anti-scientific, whatever beliefs. So they need to deprogram, to be deprogrammed, or in more religious term, to deconvert, because they are now converted into believing some whatever ideas. Yes, like a robot. And we can see friends or people for instance, here in Mexico, in the political terrain, behaving like this, saying, showing, doing some insane things, and more insane by each day. So at the end, I don't believe in solutions, because in some circumstances it's getting worse and worse. But well, we have these deprogramming or deconversion techniques or approaches. And in a more positive or practical way, perhaps is by developing knowledge ability, being informed, have all this information of how to detect fake news, whatever, to exert epistemic vigilance, be aware of epistemics, and build in ourselves or in a collective way an epistemic agency, to become epistemic agents with respect to the various strategies used by some actors like politicians or anti-scientists and so on, like groups, think tanks, companies, states or politicians or journalists to produce post-truth regimes. For instance, in the case of interest of climate inaction and climate obstruction, non-effective ways of dealing with the climate emergency, the following are common post-truth mechanisms that should be known and counter upon using, I don't know which heuristics. So we have the common repertoire of post-truth, like fake news, alternative facts, misinformation, disinformation, bullshit discourse, buffoonery, etc. From other point of view, we have this pressure on having individuals to be accountable and responsible for the climate crisis. So recycle and all that, which has a valid point of reason, but it's not very effective. Then we have two not very known phenomenon, psychological phenomenon. This comes from psychology, which is interpassivity. Slavoj Žižek works very well this concept. Although it comes from Robert Thaler from Vienna, from Wien. And gaslighting, yes, like the movie or the play. Gaslighting is getting more attention nowadays on this context of the Anthropocene or the climate change and all that. And gaslighting is a little bit different from Ingmar Bergman's case in the movie, in which he is deceived by his husband, making her believe in fake news, so to say. So at the end, she's getting crazy. And if we are gaslightees, we may think that we are crazy or irrational or anti-progress or whatever, but the gaslighter is manipulating our psyche. And I discovered this article on the strategies that I think they're very useful. They're from rhetoric point of view. So in rhetoric...
Can you wrap it up here, Carlos?
Yes, we have two actors, the gaslighter or the manipulator and the manipulee, the victim. And there are three appeals. Two are reason, logos, two are ethos or identity, and are emotions and effects. And that's very evident in post-truth regimes. And three attacks. So again, logocentric or ethotic from ethos or pathemic. And I think, and I finish with this, I think this, I find this scheme, this idea of using rhetoric for countering post-truth today, more than post-truth, because post-truth in itself is not that dangerous. If we don't see in these three trials, three appeals and three attacks. But well, that's it.
Thank you, Carlos.
Okay.
Let's move on straight away to Irina, your suggestion as to the means to countering post-truth.
Yeah, so I'll just be brief and say that I think because for me, polarization is really at the core of this. And one of the things that happens when we polarize against each other is we also dehumanize each other. So we stop when we're far apart enough, and when we really start to see people as being just members of groups as opposed to other individuals like ourselves with a diverse set of beliefs, then we start to see them as less human, and at the psychological level we actually start to ascribe less human characteristics to them. We don't think that they feel the same way that we feel, or that they make decisions, or that they relate in the way we relate. And this is what happens in wartime. A lot of times the way that we get to a point where we can go and kill other people is we no longer see them as people, actually. And so this is happening now in our society, and it's manifesting in a lot of different ways. And so everything we can do to rehumanize each other for ourselves, I think, is really vital. And the information bubbles exacerbate this process. And so I think because we're not talking to each other, so I think this is hard to implement, but the more that we can recreate connections in conversations and actually coming into contact with each other, the more chance we have to undo some of that dehumanization. And it has to happen in the right circumstances, for sure. Like, we don't want to have the kind of contact where, you know, some people are in a position of power, other people are quite disempowered, and then, you know, there they are in this completely uneven playing field, struggling. That's not what we're looking for. We're looking for situations where people can actually make contact, and they could disagree and they could have different positions, but to the extent that they're able to engage with each other, that tends psychologically to undo the dehumanization process. Even if you disagree with the person, the fact of having them in the same space as you, at the body level, at the cognitive level, at the emotional level, makes you experience them in a different way. Like, we know a lot about how on social media, people can be so nasty and so violent towards others in a way that they could never do in person. So the more that and I know we live in a world now where that's very, very hard to do, but to the extent that it's possible, I don't know, in the context of elections, in the context of education, of sports, whatever it is, to actually have regular human interactions, I think that can help. And also, especially if we have some tools for how to hold those sessions of contact, with listening, with respect, with kindness, with knowing how to work with conflict, hold space for difference, so those spaces can be facilitated, that's that much better. There's wonderful organizations that support that, Braver Angels, many others, but to really intentionally create those spaces of human contact and listening.
Thank you. Thank you. So enlightening, Irina, and wondering to what extent the Anthropocene, while on the one hand might bring a lot of human suffering, might perhaps at the same time spark or create the conditions for humanity to react as a whole in that direction. Thank you so much. And Velina, your reply to the last question, please.
I'm just going to do this in 2 sentences, just so we save the 10 minutes for questions, because in fact, this conference to this day has made my point for me. I'll just say we need a human economy. We need a care economy. We need one that privileges and centers well-being and humanness and humanity, and therefore brings in the 90% or the 99% to be able to have these exchanges and interactions that Irina is mentioning. Because if we continue to behave as if the desires and the choices of the 1% are more important than anything else, than other humans, or than nature, or than the future, or than our communication with each other as human beings, then yeah, that there will be no truth or no social fabric to speak of.
Indeed. Wonderful. Thank you so much. So thank you, Irina, for considering our audience. Since we have only a few minutes left, what I will do is to read some of the questions and allow for the last round, last brief intervention from each of you. So Elliot, who was quite active in promoting this session, says, post-truth may have started as an ideological expression, but in the last few years, it turned into a huge profiteering operation, as we have seen with the likes of Alex Jones and InfoWars or Steve Bannon in his War Room video podcast in the US. Then he asked directly, Irina, do you agree that on-demand media and social network algorithms nurture in good part the confirmation bias that most people may have? That's why they go down the rabbit hole. And Irina, you replied already, so I will move on to Grisel Rodriguez's question. Is it possible that the same way that the intense consumption of extreme media is available to these groups, it could be used as a means to counter the disinformation and misinformation? Let's give a 1 minute shot to each of you as a last round.
There's
Carlos.
one more question there. It says, don't you think,
Yes.
Carlos, that one, that we need community-based organizations?
All right. Yes, sorry, I missed that. So, Carlos, you can address actually that question. Community-based.
The question again, Javier?
Don't you think, Carlos, that we really need community-based organizations to reach out to those individuals who have fallen to post-truth to help deprogram them?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure because we have many recipes or methods, steps. Go to the sources, double check the information, fact check, and all that. Very rational, very intellectual, very logocentric. But there's more to logos, of reason, of science, of epistemics. So we have the emotional, because that's the important part of post-truth, the emotion and negative emotions. So that's very difficult to deal with. Reason is okay, but we are not Dr. Spocks. We're not androids with a very efficient brain. We have like almost 200 cognitive biases. 200. That's a lot. It's not only confirmation bias or cognitive dissonance.
Okay.
So.
Wonderful. Let's leave it there and let's connect with what Irina was telling us before about this emotional domain as well and cultural domain. Yes, please, Irina.
Well, what you're saying now is making me think about the fact that, we're living in very difficult times. I mean, for an average person to grapple with the idea of climate change and all of this political unrest and an epidemic, I mean, people are really stressed. Like, I'm here at COP and listening to young people talking about their expectations for the future, and a lot of them don't even have a feeling there is a future. A lot of them aren't considering creating the next generation. It's a very, very unique time for our civilization, and people are confronted with a global threat like we've never had. I mean, there's been obviously very difficult times in many societies, and I think that's the backdrop in which all of this is happening, and people are feeling extremely vulnerable. And when we're that vulnerable and that threatened, we tend to grasp onto our beliefs and try to hold on even tighter, and really tend to follow more authoritarian rulers, and subscribe to things that could be really detrimental. And so I think, to the extent that we can be aware of that we're not just drawn to misinformation, but what's the feeling reality behind that? And maybe we need to acknowledge the grief and the fear and terror, in the sense of being lost that people are experiencing, that's really making them vulnerable to this kind of misinformation, just like people become vulnerable to being recruited into terrorist organizations because of poverty and being dislocated and having their lives being totally destroyed. That typically precedes people joining really kind of on not great things, and so that is also, I think, part of countering this state that we're in, is actually improving people's well-being in the ways that are possible.
Wonderful. Irina, back to the activist playfield. Your last words.
I'll just say the way that we have differences in our immediate circles and even families, the way that I'm more different to my family, I'm also very similar to many other people around the world. And the kind of boundaries and borders that existed, they don't anymore, right? Or they do, but they've become more porous in a whole other way. And so for me, one thing that we're trying to do as an organization that is important is solidarity, is building up this sense of solidarity around values that matter, such as fairness, such as care, such as support to one another, such as equity, such as being able to envision a future, because as Irina says, not being able to see one is a dangerous place to live. And I think, I think there is promise in that. There's no guarantee, but there's promise in that.
Good note to leave it here, my dear friends. Thank you so much. We ran out of time. Wonderful session, and looking forward to collaborating again. Thank you so much.
Nice to meet you.
So great to be
everyone.
with you.
Bye.